Episode 9, Safety Data Sheets, Physical and Chemical Properties. This is also Section 9, found on the Standard 16 section Safety Data Sheet. This safety short is brought to you by the Occupational Safety Leadership Podcast. My name is Dr. David Ayers, and let's get started. So Section 9, Physical and Chemical Properties then. So this is the section where they sit down and actually describe exactly what the chemical looks like, smells like. I'm glad they don't put down taste like. I hope that we never have to taste the chemical. So let's sit down and look at a couple of the minimum required information sections. You will find a lot of SDSs that go beyond the minimum and they list other things. So the one thing that we're going to cover is just the absolute minimum that has to be found on the SDSs. Along with this, if it does not apply, there's typically a NA. Sometimes a company will just leave it blank. So let's get started. The first thing, the appearance. So this is when it's going to go through the physical state, the color. Is it a solid, a liquid, a gas? Is it yellow, green? Just kind of a way that if you were just to look at it, that you would say, or not say, but you would say, I now know what the following chemical looks like. It's going to talk about the flammability, so the upper and lower limits out there. So for any of the old timers like me, when you had that carburetor, you had to get the oxygen and fuel mixture just right. If you didn't have it within that upper and lower limits, you just could not make that carburetor work and make the car run and all that. So everything, I shouldn't say everything, things that are flammable typically are going to have a limit in there, and that limit, think about that as a window where they can operate. It may be something like 7 to 12%. Under 7, it's too lean, can't burn. Over 12 is too rich, can't burn. Odor. Is it a sweet smell? Is it I've seen one that's called a sickly. I don't know what a sickly smell is, but just kind of a way to describe what it smells like. Vapor pressure talks about your odor threshold then. So sometimes you can find a SDS with an odor threshold, and for this example, I'm just throwing out numbers. Let's say that the odor threshold is 100 ppms. Well, you could find that the PEL or the TLV or whatever standard that you're going by to look at occupational exposure, you are overexposed if you're over 50. So sometimes things, when you smell them, you already know, all right, I'm already over. And so I needed to put in engineering controls, PPE, words to that effect then. So, and finally for this slide, vapor density. So heavier than air, lighter than air, like what's it going to do when it gets out of its container or so. Let's go to the next slide. A little bit more on physical and chemical properties. My favorite, pH then. So this helps me to understand, is it acidic or is it on the base side? It also helps me to understand that I typically will have to get rid of this at some point. Do I have to neutralize it? Can I pour it down the drain? And my system will take care of it itself. If I have a automated system, say that my operating permit says that I can only discharge between a pH of 5 and 9. We'll just say it's a very, very wide range, of course. So if I use something that's a 2, well, how do I make sure that this is not discharging before I either bring it up to 5 or I do something where I'm going to capture it and make sure that it does not get out then. A couple of other ones, the melting point or the freezing point. So this is typically found on solids for the melting point then. The freezing point, of course, will go for things like liquids then, you know. Obviously, the more and more things have water in them, typically the more they freeze closer to 32, but that's not always the case. And that's why that we have to sit down and read and really understand all this stuff then. When we look at a SDS sheet, we just can't assume that somehow we just automatically know. Let's go on to the next slide. This is where they're going to talk a little bit about the fire in here. Is it going to catch fire, not catch fire? So this is where we get to the boiling point and the boiling range, which also leads to a flashpoint then, At what temperature is it going to give off fumes that can catch fire? Of course, it still has to be within that range, but that doesn't mean that it's not liberating those fumes that can catch on fire. Is there a auto ignition temperature associated with this whole thing? And is there a evaporation rate? Is it going to evaporate fast, or is it something that if it spills, it literally will not change its volume because it just does not evaporate at a very quick rate? So with this slide here, we look at the decomposition temperature. So is it something that's very, very stable? And of course, either the hotter or the colder it gets, it will start to decompose then. Flammability, is it a solid, a liquid? I'm sorry, is it a solid or a gas? And then finally, the catch-all, of course, if it doesn't, if not every chemical is going to have all of this data and info. It really depends on what that chemical is. If it doesn't have that, it could have a Na, it could have a blank, and we also talked about how what I just covered today is only going to be the absolute minimum then. There's a lot of companies that put on more on here, and that's great because as a safety guy, I want as much data as I can get my hands on. Because like all things, I have to know exactly how to handle this. Do my folks have the correct training? Do I have the engineering controls to make sure that I can really handle this? I mean, as safely as I possibly can, and maybe as an absolute last resort, I have to think about things like personal protective equipment, since there are just some things that are just next to impossible to engineer out. You can do a great job of reducing that potential hazard, but some things are super hard to engineer out 100%. And that's today's Safety Short. So episode 9 on safety data sheets, physical and chemical properties, also section 9 found on your standard 16th section SDS. I'd like to thank the Occupational Safety Leadership Podcast for this episode. My name is Dr. David Ayers. Have a safe day.